The dinner table went silent the moment she said it. "You'll never be one of us." 6 words. Delivered calmly, almost pleasantly, the way you'd comment on the weather. My mother-in-law, Vivian, said it while reaching for the gravy boat, not even bothering to look at me when the words left her mouth. As if I wasn't significant enough to warrant eye contact while she dismantled me in front of her entire family. I felt my fork stop halfway to my plate. Across the table, my husband Tom kept eating. He didn't look up. He didn't say anything. He simply continued chewing his roast beef as if his mother hadn't just told his wife of 7 years that she would never belong to this family, not now, not ever, not after 7 Thanksgivings and 7 Christmases and 7 years of trying. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I want you to understand who I am, what I had endured to arrive at that exact moment, and why those 6 words, spoken so casually, so dismissively, were not just an insult. They were the last mistake Vivian Ashford ever made. But to understand why, I need to take you back. Not just to that dinner table, but to the beginning. To the woman I was before I married into this family, and the woman I slowly, painfully became while trying to earn a place at a table where I was never actually welcome. My name doesn't matter for this story. Call me Claire. I met Tom when I was 26, working as a marketing coordinator at a mid-size firm in Chicago. He was kind, ambitious, and slightly too eager to please his mother in ways that should have concerned me from the very first conversation he had about her. "My mom can be a lot," he told me on our 3rd date, laughing it off the way people laugh off things they've decided not to examine too closely. "She just wants what's best for me. She's protective." I thought that was sweet at the time. A devoted son. A close family. I came from a small family myself. My parents divorced when I was 12, my mother worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and the idea of a large, established family with traditions and dinners and a matriarch who cared deeply about her children sounded, frankly, like something out of a movie I desperately wanted to be in. I had no idea what I was walking into. The first time I met Vivian, she was perfectly pleasant. Warm, even. She hugged me, told me Tom had spoken highly of me, asked about my work with what seemed like genuine interest. I remember driving home that night feeling like I had passed some invisible test. I called my mother and told her how lovely Tom's family was. It took almost a year for the cracks to show. They were small at first. The kind of small that makes you question your own perception rather than the person causing it. A comment about my background, delivered with a smile that made the insult feel like a compliment if you weren't paying close attention. A comment about my career, as if my entire profession was a placeholder until I found something worthy of the Ashford name. A comment about my appearance, my clothes, my background, my family, my opinions, my taste in wine, my cooking, always wrapped in the same syrupy, performative warmth that made it nearly impossible to call out without looking like I was the one being difficult. I started keeping a mental list. Not because I wanted to be petty, but because I needed proof, for myself, mostly, that I wasn't imagining things. That the slow drip of condescension was real and not some insecurity I was projecting onto an otherwise lovely woman. Tom noticed some of it. Not all of it. He'd occasionally say she doesn't mean it like that, or that's just how she talks to everyone, which I later learned was demonstrably false, because I watched Vivian dote on Tom's sister-in-law, Madison, with an entirely different energy. Madison, who had grown up 3 streets over from the Ashford estate. Madison, whose family had known the Ashfords for 2 generations. Madison, who belonged in a way I apparently never would, no matter how many holidays I hosted or how many of Vivian's increasingly specific demands I accommodated. I tried. I tried so hard. I learned to cook her favorite dishes for family gatherings. I remembered her birthday, her anniversary, the anniversary of her late husband's death, sending flowers every year without being asked. I sat through hours of conversations about people I had never met, family history I had no connection to, traditions I was expected to honor without ever being told I belonged to them. I told myself this was normal. That every woman who marries into a family has to earn her place. That Vivian's coolness was simply a generational thing, a protectiveness over her only son, and that time would soften it. 7 years. That's how long I gave it. 7 years of biting my tongue during dinners where she'd accidentally forget my dietary restrictions despite reminding her every single time. 7 years of watching her introduce me to her friends as Tom's wife instead of by my name, as if I was simply an extension of him rather than a person with my own identity. 7 years of small, accumulated cuts that I told myself didn't matter individually, even as they built into something I was carrying everywhere, every day, like stones in my pockets. And through all of it, Tom stayed quiet. Not cruel. Tom was never cruel to me directly. But his silence in the face of his mother's behavior was its own kind of wound, a wound that scarred over wrong, the way an untreated injury does, leaving something permanently misshapen beneath the surface. I used to ask him, gently at first and then with increasing frustration over the years, why he never said anything. Why he let his mother speak to me the way she did. Why, when I would come home from family dinners and cry in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear, he never once confronted her. "She's my mother, Claire," he'd say, as if that explained everything. As if blood absolved a person of basic human decency. "I can't just cut her off." "I'm not asking you to cut her off," I'd respond. "I'm asking you to defend me. Just once." He never did. Not really. He'd offer soft, watered-down responses to his mother, "Mom, come on," or "That's not fair," delivered with the energy of a man asking someone to please pass the salt rather than someone defending his wife's dignity. And Vivian, sensing the lack of real resistance, would simply continue, emboldened by the knowledge that her son's loyalty to her would always, eventually, outweigh whatever discomfort his wife was experiencing. I didn't hate Tom during those years. I loved him. That's the complicated, maddening truth about staying in situations like this. You don't stay because you're foolish or weak. You stay because the person causing you pain through their inaction is also the person who makes you laugh until your stomach hurts, who held your hand through your father's funeral, who knows exactly how you take your coffee and brings it to you without being asked. Love and resentment can occupy the same heart simultaneously. I learned that lesson slowly, painfully, over 7 years of Thanksgivings and Christmases and birthday dinners at Vivian's enormous dining table, the one with the imported French china that I was never quite trusted to set correctly. Which brings us back to that night. The dinner that changed everything. It was a Sunday in early November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Vivian had invited the whole family over for what she called a pre-holiday gathering, though I'd come to understand that Vivian simply liked having reasons to remind everyone whose house, whose rules, and whose family this ultimately was. The conversation that evening had turned, as it often did, to family history. Vivian loved nothing more than discussing the Ashford lineage, her late husband's grandfather who'd founded the family's original business, the property that had been passed down for 3 generations, the specific qualities that made an Ashford an Ashford. I had learned, over the years, to simply nod along during these conversations. To smile politely while my own history, my own family, my own lineage was treated as irrelevant background noise compared to the grand narrative of the family I'd married into. But that night, something shifted. Madison had mentioned, almost in passing, that she and Daniel were thinking of naming their unborn 3rd child after Vivian's late husband, a tradition, she explained, that kept the family name alive properly. Vivian beamed with pride, practically glowing at the suggestion. And then, without any clear provocation, she turned to me. "You know," she said, setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision, "I think that's so important. Keeping things in the family. Real family." She paused, looking at me directly for what felt like the first time all evening. Not everyone understands that, of course. I felt my stomach tighten. I knew, somehow, that this was building towards something. "Mom," Tom said, his voice carrying the same weak warning tone he always used, the one that had never once stopped her. Vivian ignored him entirely. "I just think," she continued, reaching for the gravy boat as casually as if she were discussing the weather, "that some people try very hard to belong somewhere they simply don't. And honestly, Claire," she said my name, finally, after years of avoiding it, "I think it's time someone said it plainly instead of dancing around it for everyone's comfort." The table had gone quiet. Daniel was staring at his plate. Madison's hand had stopped mid-air, holding her wine glass without drinking from it. Tom's jaw had tightened, but he still hadn't said a word. Vivian looked directly at me, her expression calm, almost kind, the way someone delivers devastating news with practiced gentleness. "You'll never be one of us," she said. She poured the gravy over her potatoes, set the boat back down, and resumed eating as if she had simply commented on the weather forecast. I sat there, fork frozen halfway to my plate, feeling 7 years of accumulated silence crystallize into something hard and clear inside my chest. I looked at Tom. He looked back at me, his expression somewhere between apologetic and helpless, the same expression he'd worn for 7 years every single time his mother had done exactly this, except smaller, except quieter, except wrapped in enough plausible deniability that I'd been able to convince myself it wasn't really happening. This time, there was no plausible deniability. This time, she had said it plainly, in front of everyone, with absolute clarity. "You'll never be one of us." I set my fork down slowly. I looked around the table, at Daniel's averted eyes, at Madison's frozen discomfort, at Tom's familiar, useless silence, and finally back at Vivian, who was calmly continuing her meal as though she hadn't just detonated something that had been building, quietly, for 7 years. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply smiled, a small, genuine smile that surprised even me, and said, "You're right, Vivian." The table went still again, confusion replacing the earlier discomfort. "I'll never be one of you," I continued, my voice calm, almost pleasant, mirroring the exact tone she'd used moments before. "And honestly, I think that's the first thing you've ever said to me that I completely agree with." I stood up from the table, folded my napkin neatly beside my plate, and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Tom's chair scrape against the floor as he stood to follow. I heard Vivian's voice, sharper now, asking what on earth I meant by that. I heard Daniel say something quietly to Madison. But I didn't turn around. Because in that exact moment, walking out of that dining room and into the cold November night, I had already made a decision. Vivian had spent 7 years making sure I knew I would never belong to the Ashford family. She had no idea that I had spent the last 6 months quietly preparing for exactly this moment, gathering documents, making calls, building something she couldn't have anticipated. She thought she was delivering an insult that would simply hurt me, the way her comments always had. She had no idea she was about to lose everything she'd spent her entire life protecting. "I need to take you back 6 months, to before the dinner, before the gravy boat, before the 6 words that finally broke something in me that had been cracking for years. Because the information that made everything possible didn't come from some elaborate scheme I'd constructed. It came, almost accidentally, from a conversation I never expected to matter. My mother's financial advisor, a meticulous woman named Patricia Hendricks who had been managing Diane's modest retirement accounts for over a decade, called me one afternoon in May to discuss some paperwork related to my mother's cancer treatment and the insurance claims that were piling up. During our conversation, almost as an aside, Patricia mentioned that she'd recently taken on a new client through a referral, someone going through a complicated situation involving a family trust that had been mismanaged for years. She didn't mention names. She didn't need to. The details she described, almost without thinking, painted a picture I recognized immediately, even though every part of me wanted to believe I was wrong. A family trust established 3 generations ago. A business that had been the foundation of the family's wealth for decades. A pattern of withdrawals that didn't match the official accounting. A primary beneficiary who controlled the trust with almost no oversight, having quietly consolidated authority over the family's finances after her husband's death. "It's a mess," Patricia said, shaking her head slightly through the phone. "The woman managing it has been treating the trust like her personal account for years. Moving money around, making loans to herself that never get repaid, using trust funds for personal expenses that have nothing to do with the family business. The kind of thing that works fine until someone actually looks closely." I asked, carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral, who had referred this client to her. "A friend of a friend," Patricia said. "Apparently the family's longtime accountant retired last year, and the new one they brought in raised some red flags before quietly resigning. This new client found my name through him." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I didn't ask Patricia for details. I didn't need to. I had married into a family with exactly this profile, a business spanning 3 generations, a trust that Vivian had controlled with absolute authority since her husband's death 12 years earlier, an accountant who had quietly resigned the previous year under circumstances Tom had described, dismissively, as creative differences without ever elaborating further. I spent the next several weeks in a strange state of suspended knowledge, aware that something significant might be happening within the Ashford family's finances, but unwilling to investigate further, unwilling to confirm what I increasingly suspected. Part of this hesitation was genuine uncertainty about whether I was right. Part of it was a lingering loyalty to a marriage and a family I was still, at that point, trying to make work. But there was another part of me, quieter, more honest, that recognized I was gathering information I might eventually need. Filing it away, the way you do with uncomfortable knowledge you're not ready to act on but aren't quite ready to discard either. The pieces started fitting together more clearly over the following months, mostly through small comments Tom made without realizing their significance. There was the conversation in June, when Tom mentioned that his mother had been stressed about some accounting stuff related to the family business, a mid-sized manufacturing company that Vivian's late husband had built and that Daniel now nominally ran, though Vivian retained controlling interest through the family trust. I noted, silently, that Tom's father had died 12 years earlier, which meant any disorganized paperwork from years ago couldn't possibly explain ongoing discrepancies that a newly hired accountant was discovering in real time. There was another comment in August, when Daniel mentioned, during a rare moment of openness at a family barbecue, that the business's profit margins had been tighter than they should be for the past several years, despite steady revenue. He'd said it almost as a joke, but I filed it away alongside everything else. By September, I had enough scattered pieces to form a clear picture, even without any concrete proof. Vivian had been treating the family trust, established by her late husband specifically to provide for Daniel, Tom, and eventually their children, with provisions that explicitly limited how much she could personally withdraw for her own use, as an unlimited personal resource. She had been doing this, based on what I could piece together, for years, likely since shortly after her husband's death, when grief and authority had combined to give her unchecked access to money that legally belonged, in significant part, to her sons and their future families. I didn't tell Tom what I suspected. Part of me didn't tell him because I genuinely wasn't certain. I had pieces of a puzzle, not a complete picture, and accusing my mother-in-law of financial misconduct without solid proof would have been reckless, potentially damaging to a marriage that was already strained. But part of me, the more honest part, didn't tell him because some quiet, self-protective instinct recognized that this information might matter someday, in ways I couldn't yet fully articulate. I was building a kind of insurance policy without consciously deciding to do so, the way people sometimes prepare for endings they're not yet ready to admit are coming. So I waited. I gathered what information I could without actively investigating, which mostly meant paying closer attention to comments Tom and Daniel made, occasionally asking gentle, seemingly innocent questions during family conversations, and maintaining a careful mental file of everything that didn't quite add up. By the time Vivian said those 6 words at the dinner table in November, I had been quietly accumulating this knowledge for nearly 6 months. And in that moment, standing in the driveway with Tom, telling him that something had changed, I understood with complete clarity what I was actually deciding to do. I was going to make sure the truth about the family trust came to light. Not out of cruelty, exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't satisfaction in the idea. But because Vivian had spent years positioning herself as the unquestionable matriarch of a family built on tradition and legitimacy, the very tradition and legitimacy she'd used to tell me I would never belong to. And the entire foundation of that authority rested on financial misconduct that, if exposed, would fundamentally alter how everyone in that family saw her. I called Patricia Hendricks 3 days after the dinner. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to be honest with me, even if it puts you in an uncomfortable position. That client you mentioned a few months ago. The family trust situation. I think I might know who that is." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Claire, you understand I can't discuss details of another client's situation. Even hypothetically. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you, if my suspicion is correct, whether there's someone you'd recommend I talk to. A lawyer who specializes in this kind of thing. Trust litigation, family business disputes, that sort of expertise." "There's someone," Patricia said carefully. "A woman named Rosalind Kim. She specializes in exactly this kind of situation, family trusts, beneficiary disputes, that sort of complexity. I can give you her information, but Claire, I want to be clear that I'm not confirming or denying anything about my other clients. Are you doing this because you're hurt, or because something is genuinely wrong that needs to be addressed?" "Both," I said finally. "I think both things can be true at the same time." Patricia gave me Rosalind Kim's information, and I called her office the following Monday. Rosalind Kim turned out to be exactly the kind of lawyer I needed, sharp, methodical, entirely unsentimental about the emotional complexities of family disputes, focused instead on the concrete mechanics of trust law and fiduciary responsibility. During our first consultation, I explained everything I knew, every fragment of conversation I'd pieced together over the previous 6 months, every suspicion I'd developed about how Vivian had been managing the family trust since her husband's death. "Here's what I need you to understand," Rosalind said, after listening to my entire account without interruption. "If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't a small issue. Mismanagement of a trust where the trustee is also a primary beneficiary, with withdrawal patterns that don't match documented loans or authorized distributions, this is potentially serious fiduciary breach. We're talking about real legal exposure for your mother-in-law, depending on the scope and duration of what's been happening." "What would that mean practically?" "It could mean she's required to repay misappropriated funds, with interest. It could mean she's removed as trustee entirely, with that responsibility transferred to a neutral third party or to your husband and his brother directly. In more serious cases, depending on the amounts involved and whether there's evidence of deliberate concealment, it could potentially involve criminal exposure, though that's less common in family trust disputes unless the amounts are substantial or the deception is particularly egregious." I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling the weight of what I was potentially setting into motion. "I need to ask you something honestly," Rosalind continued. "You're not currently a beneficiary of this trust yourself, correct? As the spouse of one of the beneficiaries?" "Correct. The trust documents, from what Tom has told me, name him and his brother specifically. Spouses aren't direct beneficiaries. That actually works in your favor here, in terms of how this needs to proceed legally. You can't personally bring a legal action regarding the trust's mismanagement, you don't have standing as a non-beneficiary. But you absolutely can, and should, share what you know with your husband, who does have standing as a direct beneficiary. He would need to be the one to formally pursue any action, whether that's requesting an audit, pursuing removal of the trustee, or seeking repayment of misappropriated funds. This was the piece I'd been avoiding fully considering until that exact moment. I couldn't simply expose Vivian's financial misconduct on my own, satisfying as that fantasy might have been. I needed Tom to understand what I discovered, And more importantly, I needed him to be willing to act on it, to finally, after 7 years of silence, stand up to his mother in a way he'd never once been willing to do for my sake. I left Rosalind's office that afternoon with a folder full of notes about trust law, fiduciary responsibility, and the specific legal steps required to formally request a trust audit. I also left with a much clearer understanding of the conversation I needed to have with Tom. I waited 4 days before bringing it up. We were sitting in our kitchen on a Thursday evening, the dishes from dinner still in the sink, when I finally said what I'd been preparing to say for days. I need to tell you something about your mother's handling of the family trust. Tom looked up from his phone, his expression shifting immediately into something cautious. What do you mean? I told him everything. The conversation with Patricia Hendricks months earlier. The pieces I'd gathered from his own comments and Daniel's offhand remarks. The pattern that had emerged, suggesting Vivian had been treating the trust as a personal resource for years, potentially in violation of the trust's actual terms and her fiduciary responsibility as trustee. Tom listened in silence, his face growing increasingly pale as I laid out everything I'd pieced together. You're telling me you've known this for months and didn't say anything? I wasn't certain, Tom. I had pieces, not proof. And honestly, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with information like that, especially given how things were between your mother and me. So you waited until after she insulted you at dinner to bring this up? That feels pretty calculated, Claire. I felt a flash of anger at that, sharper than I expected. I'm not the one who insulted anyone, Tom. I'm not the one who spent years treating family money like a personal slush fund while telling everyone how important tradition and legacy are. I came across information that suggests your mother might be doing something seriously wrong, and I'm telling you about it because you're her son, you're a direct beneficiary of that trust, and you deserve to know. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the kitchen table. What do you want me to do with this? I think you need to talk to a lawyer. I think you and Daniel both need to request a formal audit of the trust. I think you need to find out, definitively, whether what I suspect is actually happening, and if it is, you need to decide what you're willing to do about it. And if I do nothing? If this is all just family stuff that gets handled quietly, the way it always has? I looked at him directly, feeling something settle inside me with absolute clarity. Then I think we both already know what that means for us. The conversation that followed lasted until nearly 2 a.m, covering every possible angle of fear and doubt and complicated loyalty that 7 years of marriage and a lifetime of family dynamics had created. Tom oscillated between anger at me for not telling him sooner, fear about what this would mean for his relationship with his mother, and a slowly dawning recognition that the pattern I was describing matched too many small, troubling details he'd noticed himself over the years but had never allowed himself to fully examine. By the time we finally went to bed, exhausted and uncertain, Tom had agreed to one thing: he would call his brother Daniel the next morning and have an honest conversation about the accounting irregularities that Daniel himself had mentioned, almost in passing, months earlier. What neither of us knew yet was that Daniel had been having his own private suspicions for nearly a year, suspicions he'd been too afraid to voice directly, partly out of loyalty to his mother and partly out of fear of what it might mean for the family business he'd spent his entire career building alongside her. The conversation between Tom and Daniel that Friday morning would become the actual turning point, the moment when private suspicion, held separately by multiple people for different reasons, finally became collective action. Daniel agreed to formally request the trust documents and recent financial records from the family's law firm, citing his role as a beneficiary and co-manager of the business. He made the request the following Monday, using language Rosalind Kim had carefully helped Tom draft over the weekend, framing it as a routine review rather than an accusation. Vivian's response came faster than any of us expected. She called Tom directly on Tuesday evening, her voice tighter and more controlled than he'd ever heard it. Daniel says you two want to review the trust documents, she said, skipping any pleasantries entirely. I want to know why. It's just routine, Mom. Daniel and I think it makes sense to understand the trust's current status, especially with the business growing. That's not what this is about, Thomas, and you know it. Her use of his full name signaled exactly how seriously she was taking this development. Someone has been putting ideas in your head. Tom, to his credit, didn't immediately deflect or apologize, the way he had for years during conversations with his mother. Mom, if everything with the trust is fine, then a review won't be a problem. If it's not fine, then I think we need to know that, regardless of who suggested looking into it. There was a long silence on the line. I see, Vivian said finally, her voice colder now, more controlled. I see exactly what's happening here. She hung up without saying anything further. 3 days later, Vivian called an emergency family dinner, not at her house this time, but at a restaurant, a public setting that Tom later realized had likely been a deliberate choice, an attempt to control the emotional temperature of whatever conversation she was planning by removing the privacy that might allow for genuine confrontation. I wasn't initially invited. The dinner, as Vivian framed it to Tom, was meant to be family only, meaning, specifically, herself, Tom, and Daniel, with Madison included but explicitly excluding me. When Tom told me about the dinner and the explicit exclusion, something settled inside me, cold and clear. Of course she's excluding me, I said. I'm the one who told you about this. She knows exactly what's happening, and she's trying to isolate you and Daniel without my influence in the room. I'm not going without you, Tom said. It was, I realized later, the first time in 7 years that Tom had directly refused one of his mother's explicit instructions about how a family gathering should be structured. We arrived at the restaurant together that Thursday evening, and I watched Vivian's expression shift the moment she saw me walk in beside Tom, a flicker of surprise, quickly controlled, replaced by the same composed mask she always wore in social settings. I didn't realize Claire would be joining us, she said evenly, as we approached the table. She's my wife, Tom said simply. Of course she's joining us. It was such a small statement. 4 words, delivered without dramatic emphasis, the kind of thing that should have been obvious and unremarkable in any healthy marriage. But after 7 years of watching Tom defer to his mother's preferences over my own dignity, those 4 words felt like an earthquake. We sat down. Vivian's expression had shifted into something harder, more guarded than I'd ever seen from her, the practiced warmth completely absent, replaced by the cold calculation of someone who understood, finally, that the ground beneath her was no longer as stable as she'd assumed. I want to address whatever this nonsense is about the trust, she said, once everyone had been seated. I've managed this family's finances responsibly since your father died, and I won't have my own children questioning my integrity based on whatever paranoid suspicions someone has put in your heads. Daniel, sitting beside Madison, spoke up for the first time that evening. Mom, nobody's accusing you of anything yet. We just want to see the documentation. If everything's fine, this takes 10 minutes and we move on. And if you find something that isn't fine, as you put it, what then? You drag your own mother through some humiliating legal process, destroy this family's reputation, all because someone, she glanced at me directly, her composure finally cracking just slightly, decided to go digging where she had no business looking. I didn't go digging, Vivian, I said calmly, meeting her gaze directly for the first time in 7 years of careful deference. Information came to me. I shared it with my husband because he deserved to know it. What happens next isn't actually about me at all. It's about whether you've been honest with your own sons about how you've handled their inheritance. The table went silent. Madison was staring at her plate, the same way she had during the dinner weeks earlier when Vivian had delivered her final insult. Daniel was watching his mother with an expression I'd never seen on him before, something between hurt and dawning recognition, as if pieces of his own private suspicions were finally clicking into place in real time. Vivian looked at me for a long moment, and in her eyes, I saw something shift, the first real flicker of fear I'd ever witnessed in her, the recognition that the careful control she'd maintained over this family for 12 years was no longer entirely within her grasp. You have no idea what you're doing, she said quietly, her voice losing some of its usual composed certainty. "You have no idea what you're about to destroy." "I think," I said, my own voice steady despite the pounding of my heart, "that you're the one who's about to discover exactly what you've been risking all these years. Not me." The audit took 6 weeks. Daniel and Tom, working together with Rosalind Kim, formally requested a comprehensive review of the family trust's financial records dating back to the year of their father's death. Vivian, after that tense dinner at the restaurant, retreated into a kind of cold formality with both her sons, answering their calls, but briefly, providing requested documents through her own lawyer rather than directly, treating the entire process as an unforgivable betrayal rather than a reasonable request for transparency. I stayed largely in the background during those 6 weeks, by deliberate choice. Rosalind had been clear that since I wasn't a beneficiary, my direct involvement could complicate things legally and emotionally. So I supported Tom as he navigated what was, without question, one of the most painful experiences of his life, watching the carefully constructed image of his mother as a devoted, trustworthy matriarch slowly crumble under the weight of forensic accounting. The preliminary findings came back in mid-December, 2 weeks before what would have been our 8th Christmas as a married couple, though by that point, none of us were thinking much about holiday traditions. The numbers were worse than even I had suspected. Over the 12 years since her husband's death, Vivian had withdrawn approximately $1.4 million from the family trust beyond any documented or authorized distributions. The withdrawals had been structured carefully enough to avoid obvious detection, small, irregular amounts disguised as business expenses or family loans that were never repaid, funneled through accounts that the previous accountant had clearly either missed the pattern or chosen not to examine too closely. The money had gone toward exactly the kind of lifestyle maintenance you might expect, the upkeep of the Lake Forest estate far beyond what the trust's actual income should have supported, expensive trips described in the documentation as business development despite no clear connection to the manufacturing company Daniel actually ran, jewelry and luxury purchases categorized, almost laughably, as client gifts despite no corresponding client relationships that anyone could identify. Most damning of all, the forensic accountant's report identified a pattern of using newer withdrawals to obscure older ones, moving money between accounts in ways specifically designed to make a casual review appear unremarkable, while a more thorough examination revealed the entire structure as a kind of shell game that had been running, uninterrupted, for over a decade. "This isn't accidental mismanagement," Rosalind told Tom and Daniel during the meeting where the findings were presented. "This is a sustained, deliberate pattern of using your father's trust as a personal resource, while simultaneously maintaining careful enough documentation to avoid easy detection. I've seen plenty of cases of genuine confusion or poor record-keeping. This isn't that." Tom called me from his car after that meeting, his voice hollow in a way I'd never heard before. "It's real," he said simply. "All of it. Worse than what you suspected, actually." I didn't say anything for a moment, giving him space to continue. "She's been stealing from us, Claire. From me and Daniel. For 12 years. While telling everyone how important family and legacy and tradition are. While telling you that you'd never be one of us." His voice cracked slightly on that last part. "She's been the one actually betraying this family the whole time." I drove to meet him at a coffee shop near Rosalind's office, and when I arrived, I found my husband sitting in a corner booth, looking smaller and more shaken than I'd seen him in 7 years of marriage. "What happens now?" I asked, sitting down across from him. "Rosalind says we have options. We could pursue this legally, demand repayment, potentially seek her removal as trustee, even consider whether there's enough evidence for a more serious legal action given the scale and duration of what she did. Or we could try to handle it privately, as a family, get her to agree to repayment terms and stepping back from trustee responsibilities without it becoming a formal legal battle. What do you want to do?" Tom looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift in his expression, not just anger at his mother, though that was certainly present, but something deeper, more fundamental, a recognition of patterns that extended far beyond just the trust itself. "I want to know why," he said quietly. Not the financial why. Rosalind can probably explain that part well enough, the mechanics of how she did it. I mean the real why. Why she felt entitled to take this money from her own sons while simultaneously treating you like you didn't deserve to be part of this family. Why protecting her comfort always seemed to matter more than protecting either of us, in completely different ways. I reached across the table and took his hand, recognizing in that moment that something fundamental had finally shifted in him. 7 years of careful, protective deference to his mother finally giving way to a clearer, more painful understanding of who she actually was, separate from the comfortable narrative he'd maintained about her for most of his life. I think, I said carefully, that some people convince themselves they deserve things simply because they've decided, internally, that they're more important than the people around them. Your mother decided, somewhere along the way, that her comfort, her image, her control over this family mattered more than honesty with either of her sons or basic decency toward me. The trust and the way she treated me aren't actually separate things, Tom. They're the same pattern, just pointed in different directions. He was quiet for a long moment, processing that. I let her treat you horribly for 7 years because I didn't want to disappoint her, he said finally. I told myself I was being a good son, but really, I think I was just scared of what it would mean to actually stand up to her. And the whole time, she was, he trailed off, shaking his head. The whole time, she was counting on exactly that fear, I finished. From both of us, in different ways. The family meeting that followed, 2 days later, was nothing like the careful, controlled dinners Vivian had orchestrated for years. This time, it took place in Rosalind's office, with both Tom and Daniel present, along with their respective spouses, and Vivian arriving with her own lawyer. Vivian looked different that day. Smaller, somehow, despite her usual careful presentation. But underneath all of it, I could see something that looked almost like fear, an emotion I'd genuinely never witnessed in her before. I want to explain my perspective on all of this, she began, before anyone else could speak, her voice carrying a brittleness that hadn't been there during our previous confrontations. Your father left me in an impossible position when he died. The business was struggling more than any of you realized. I made decisions to keep this family afloat, to maintain the lifestyle and standing that all of you benefited from, even if the accounting got complicated along the way. Mom, Daniel said quietly, the business wasn't struggling. I run it. I see the books every single day. The business has been profitable every year since Dad died, sometimes significantly so. The complicated accounting you're describing is $1.4 million in unauthorized withdrawals over 12 years. You don't understand the pressures I was under. I understand, Daniel interrupted, his voice firmer than I'd ever heard it directed at his mother, that you took money that belonged to me and Tom, that was specifically set aside by Dad for our futures and our families, and you used it to fund a lifestyle that none of the rest of us were living. I understand that while you were doing that, you were also telling Claire she'd never be part of this family, as if she was somehow less worthy of belonging here than the version of yourself who was secretly stealing from your own children. Vivian's composure cracked further at that, her eyes welling with tears that felt, even in that moment, calculated rather than entirely genuine. I never meant for any of this to happen the way it has, she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. I made mistakes, yes. But I'm still your mother. I'm still family. Surely that means something, even now. I watched Tom's face during this exchange, watching him absorb his mother's words, watching him weigh 7 years of conditioning against the clear, undeniable evidence sitting in the documentation in front of him. Family means honesty, Tom said finally, his voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Family means treating the people we love with basic respect and decency, not deciding unilaterally who deserves to belong based on standards you apply selectively. You've spent years telling us how important tradition and legacy are, Mom, while simultaneously betraying every single value those words are supposed to represent. The negotiations that followed, conducted primarily through lawyers over the subsequent weeks, resulted in a settlement that required Vivian to repay the misappropriated funds through a combination of liquidated assets and structured payments over 5 years, to step down entirely as trustee in favor of a neutral third-party financial institution, and to formally relinquish any future control over trust distributions, with that authority transferring permanently to Tom and Daniel as the trust's primary beneficiaries. She avoided criminal prosecution, ultimately, largely because Tom and Daniel, despite everything, chose not to pursue that path. But I understood, eventually, that this was their decision to make, not mine, and that there was something genuinely meaningful in watching two brothers choose accountability and transparency over public humiliation and punishment, even toward a mother who had genuinely wronged them. The Lake Forest estate, which Vivian had maintained largely through the misappropriated funds, was eventually sold, with Vivian moving into a considerably smaller condominium in the city. The financial restructuring meant she no longer had access to the lifestyle she'd spent over a decade illegally funding, a consequence that hurt her more deeply than almost anything else that emerged from the entire situation. As for the family dynamics, they shifted in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Daniel, who had spent years deferring to his mother's authority over both the business and family decisions, found a new kind of confidence in the aftermath of the audit, stepping more fully into leadership of the manufacturing company, making decisions independently in ways he'd never quite allowed himself to before, as if discovering his mother's deception had somehow freed him to trust his own judgment more completely. Madison, who had always occupied a more comfortable position within the family than I had, found herself reckoning with her own complicated feelings about a mother-in-law she'd genuinely respected for years, struggling to reconcile the woman she thought she knew with the evidence of sustained financial deception that had emerged. And Tom changed in ways that, 7 years into our marriage, I genuinely hadn't believed were still possible. The man who had spent years offering soft, ineffective pushback against his mother's treatment of me transformed, slowly but unmistakably, into someone willing to have difficult, uncomfortable conversations directly, someone who understood, finally, the real cost of his previous silence. It wasn't a perfect transformation. There were still moments, in the months that followed, when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, moments when Tom's instinct to smooth things over, to avoid confrontation, to protect his mother's feelings even amid everything that had happened, surfaced briefly before he caught himself and chose differently. But the difference, fundamentally, was that he was choosing differently. Consistently. Deliberately. 6 months after that final dinner where Vivian had told me I'd never be one of them, Tom and I sat together at our own dining room table, just the two of us, no extended family, no carefully orchestrated dynamics designed to make me feel perpetually like an outsider, and had a conversation I'd waited 7 years to have. "I need to apologize properly," Tom said, his voice carrying a vulnerability I'd rarely seen from him. Not the kind of half-apology I used to offer when Mom said something cruel and I'd just say "come on, Mom," and move on. A real apology, for 7 years of choosing her comfort over your dignity, over and over again. I let him continue, recognizing that this moment mattered, that rushing past it or minimizing it wouldn't serve either of us. "I think I convinced myself, for years, that defending you would mean abandoning her, that there was no way to do both. But that was never actually true. I could have told her to stop without cutting her out of my life entirely. I could have created consequences for her behavior toward you without destroying our entire relationship. I just didn't, because it was easier not to, because confronting her felt scarier than watching you absorb pain that I should have been protecting you from." "Why is it different now?" I asked. He thought about that question seriously before answering. "Because I finally understand that her cruelty toward you and her dishonesty about the trust were never separate things. They were the same fundamental selfishness, just expressed in different ways. I couldn't keep telling myself she was simply difficult or protective once I saw clearly what she was actually capable of. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't keep pretending that her treatment of you over the years had been some kind of misunderstanding either. It was always the same pattern. I just didn't want to see it until I had no other choice. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying. 7 years of accumulated tension, of constantly questioning my own perceptions, of wondering whether I was somehow responsible for the distance between myself and a family I desperately wanted to belong to. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your mother," I said carefully. "I never wanted that, even during the worst of it. I just needed you to actually see what was happening, and to care enough to do something about it." "I know," Tom said. "And I'm sorry it took something this serious for me to finally get there." We didn't fully repair everything that evening, of course. Trust, once damaged across 7 years of small accumulated betrayals, doesn't simply restore itself through one honest conversation, however meaningful. But it was a genuine beginning, the first time in our marriage that I felt Tom truly understood, rather than simply acknowledged, the weight of what I'd been carrying for so long. As for Vivian, our relationship never fully recovered, and I've made peace with that reality in ways that feel healthier than the constant striving for approval that characterized our first 7 years together. We see her occasionally now, at holidays that Tom and Daniel have deliberately restructured to be more equitable, more genuinely inclusive rather than performances of tradition designed to remind everyone of their place within an artificial hierarchy. Vivian is quieter during these gatherings, chastened in ways that feel less like genuine reflection and more like resignation to circumstances she can no longer control. She has never apologized to me directly for the years of subtle cruelty, for the lemon tart thrown away, for the comments about my mother's cancer being softened by access to real family, for finally saying outright what she'd spent years implying. I've stopped waiting for that apology, recognizing that some people simply aren't capable of the kind of honest self-reflection that genuine accountability requires. What I have instead is something I value far more than her belated approval ever could have meant: a husband who finally sees clearly, a relationship with my own sense of dignity fully intact, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that Vivian's final, cruelest insult became the exact catalyst that exposed everything she'd spent over a decade trying desperately to hide. She told me, with absolute confidence, that I would never be one of them. She had no idea that her own dishonesty, her own selfishness, the same fundamental character flaws that made her treat me as unworthy of belonging, would ultimately cost her everything she'd spent her life building: the business reputation, the financial control, the carefully maintained image of herself as the devoted, trustworthy matriarch holding the family together. I think about that dinner sometimes, the gravy boat, the casual cruelty of those 6 words delivered without even the courtesy of eye contact. I think about how close I came to simply absorbing that pain the way I'd absorbed everything else for 7 years, telling myself it was just one more comment to minimize, one more wound to carry quietly. But something in me had finally reached its limit that night. Not dramatically, not with tears or raised voices, but with a quiet, clear-eyed certainty that I deserved better than a lifetime of trying to earn belonging from someone who had already decided, long before I arrived, that I would never be enough. Vivian was right about one thing, in the end. I never did become one of them, not in the way she meant it, not as someone who shared their bloodline or their decades of inherited tradition. But I became something else entirely, the person whose quiet attention to detail, whose patient gathering of information, whose refusal to simply disappear into the role of acceptable, accommodating outsider, ultimately revealed exactly who Vivian Ashford really was beneath the careful performance of devoted matriarch. She spent her entire adult life building an identity around tradition, legacy, and family loyalty. And in trying to remind me, one final time, that I would never belong to any of that, she accidentally handed me everything I needed to show everyone exactly how little those values had ever actually meant to her. That was her last mistake. And it was, without question, the moment everything finally changed. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever sat at a table absorbing words that were never meant to be survivable, words that were supposed to make you smaller, I hope you remember this. Sometimes the people who try hardest to convince you that you'll never belong are the ones most desperately trying to hide what they actually deserve to lose. If you've ever been told you're not enough by someone who claimed to love you, I want you to know you're not alone in that experience. Leave a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And if this is your first time here, This channel exists for exactly these stories, the ones about quiet strength, about patience that eventually becomes power, about the moment someone finally stops trying to earn belonging from people who never intended to give it freely. Subscribe, because the next story is waiting. And trust me, it's worth staying for.